Hello, everyone. This is Gene Quinn. I want to take a moment to encourage you to mark your calendars for March 22, 23, and 24 for next year. That's when we'll host IPWatchdog Live 2026 at the Renaissance Capitol View Hotel in Arlington, Virginia. We already have more than 65 confirmed speakers, and I anticipate we'll have a bigger, broader program than ever before, with as many as 120 or more speakers, with half being senior in-house attorneys. If you're interested in speaking, sponsoring, or being an exhibitor, don't delay. I'm already working to finalize the agenda, which will be posted shortly after the new year. So get in touch with us today if you'd like to be a part of IPWatchdog Live 2026. For more information, visit IPWatchdog.com and click on Live in the nav bar. I hope to see you there.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to IPWatchdog Unleashed, where each week we journey into the world of intellectual property to discuss the laws, news, policy, and politics of innovation, technology, and creativity. With analysis and commentary from industry thought leaders and newsmakers from around the world, IPWatchdog Unleashed is hosted by world-renowned patent attorney and the founder of IPWatchdog.com, Gene Quinn, who has twice been named one of the most influential people in the intellectual property community and recognized numerous times as one of the top IP strategists in the world. Take it away, Gene.
Thanks, Renee, and welcome everybody to this week's edition of IPWatchdog Unleashed. This week we have a special episode. We're going to talk about all of the, well, as many as we can at least, the things that mattered in 2025 and that we think may have some implication and matter moving forward into 2026 as we get ready to flip the calendar. It's also special because I have Fran Cruz with us here today, and she is with Juristat. I'll ask her to introduce herself a little bit more. We'll talk a little bit about her background. And what makes this interesting is because one of the things that we're going to do on the podcast moving forward more into 2026, which you've started seeing a little bit develop already. Last week we had Clint Mihal and John Rogitz on. We're going to have guests coming back and co-hosting with me moving forward. So you'll start to see some of the same personalities again as we continue to talk to new people in the industry and take on new issues. And I'm excited about this. And Fran, I've known Fran for a bit, and we've got become very friendly, and I think our conversations are just fantastic. I'm looking forward to bringing more of those to you all. So Fran, thanks for being here.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It is a pleasure. I love all of the content that IP Watchdog creates, and I'm just fortunate to be a part of it. I think when we were putting together this content, I think we have so much great material to share. 2025 was a big year. Before we dive in, I'll give you a brief sort of synopsis on my background. I lead the IP Solutions Group at Juristat. We're a patent analytics company, and because of this role, I've had this sort of unique privilege to spend a lot of time with in-house teams. So everybody from, chief IP counsel to, legal operations. And then I also work with a lot of the top patent firms. And I've gotten to hear a lot about, what their challenges are, how the changes at the USPTO impact them, the sort of like trickle down effect of policy change and even something like a fee increase at the USPTO and how that actually manifests in real life. And so, I get to hear a lot about how people are challenged and try to come up with solutions. I also get to go to a lot of great events, IP Watchdog Live, et cetera, included. And because of that, I get to meet a lot of wonderful people. So I've just been sort of at the intersection of a lot of change, and I'm happy to share what I've learned in the course of doing that, especially here in 2025.
And that's really why I wanted you to join the podcast on a recurring basis, because when we have our conversations, you just seem very plugged into what's going on in the industry. I like to think I'm plugged into what's going on behind the curtain in D.C., in the Beltway, on the Capitol, and in the agencies. And while you know that stuff as well, you are very plugged in with what's going on in corporations and in law firms. And I think your perspective is just fantastic, and I look forward to bringing it to the audience. And I should say, before we kick off, Fran did the heavy lifting on creating this list here. I did have some comments. I think it's a great list. We got a lot to talk about, so maybe we should just dive in, and I'll ask you, Fran, what was number one on your list and why?
Well, I put new leadership and the new administration and how it's impacted the USPTO, because I think, by having Director Squires step in and Coke Morgan Stewart, of course, as interim director in the period, we saw a huge shift in priorities. And I actually think a lot of the things we're going to talk about today, this was the catalyst for. So, when I think about the new leadership and sort of its focus areas, I think about, the big imperative of reducing the patent and trademark backlog. That's obviously created a lot of different initiatives and changed a lot of the way the USPTO does things, which we'll talk about today. Also, the sort of focus on improving patent quality and eligibility under 101. I think that's what a lot of folks are particularly excited about. And then there's a lot of strong focus on AI, both as far as implementing AI to create efficiencies at the USPTO, AI inventorship, et cetera, et cetera. So the list goes on there. And we'll talk a little bit today, too, about sort of the access to post-grant proceeding processes at the PTAB, too. So I really do feel like the new administration changed a lot of what is going on. And as a result, a lot of the things we'll talk about today sort of came from that. What about you?
I agree with that. And I think that it has to be number one, because when we get into 2, 3, and 4, they don't make any sense without number one. And they would not have happened if we hadn't had new leadership. And while I think what Coke did was fantastic, and I've known her for a number of years, even before she took on this role. So I'm a big fan of her. She was at the agency when Andre was director. So she has a lot of knowledge about what needs to be done in the office. And not surprisingly, when she took the reins, I think you saw, to some extent, a lot of the policies that Andre tried to push forward return, and only with their foot on the accelerator. I mean, the stuff that she was doing was just fantastic, in my opinion. And then now that John Squires has become director, he's put his foot yet again, I think, on the accelerator. And so the one piece that I just want to make sure people don't miss in the new leadership is Secretary Lutnick, because he does seem to have a special relationship with President Trump. You can't turn on the news and see Trump traveling the world on these trade missions and meetings and negotiations and not notice that Secretary Lutnick is right there with him at every one of these meetings. And before he was Secretary Lutnick, he was just Howard Lutnick. He was co-chair of the transition and a big part of the Trump campaign. So I say that not to make this political or anything, but there have been many times in our history where I'm not sure the Secretary of Commerce knew we had a patent office. And Secretary Lutnick has got several hundred patents himself. He's made millions and millions of dollars on his inventions. And he comes to this with those eyes and understanding what innovators of all shapes, sizes, companies need from a stable patent system. And so he's given marching orders. Now, I wouldn't say he's micromanaging, but he is supportive of change. And he's got agents of change, both in Coke originally, and now she's deputy. But now I think John Squires, now that he's fully confirmed in place, foot on the accelerator, we're going to see even more change moving forward.
I think that's absolutely right. And it's brought sort of the question of sort of patents and IP to the forefront, which I think is a positive thing.
No doubt. I mean, we need to have a strong patent system. It was what Mark Twain said. I know he said it in one of his books, but he was also an inventor himself. He had patents himself. And one of his characters said something to the effect that a country without a patent system can't do anything but walk like a crab backwards and sideways. It's not a quote, but it's pretty close. And I agree with that. You need to encourage innovation. Especially, we're in the digital era, we're in the AI era, and people who don't understand the need to encourage innovation and incentivize innovation, I think, are just missing the boat in 2025.
I think that's right. I don't think a lot of people listening to this would disagree either. I think, we got a pro-patent audience here.
Yeah. Hopefully they're saying amen, brother. Amen.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
let's okay. So we're probably going to come back to Squires and Letnick and Morgan as we talk about a number of these things.
That's
but
right.
Number 2 on your list was a specific item that they really have shook up. And what is that?
Yes, that's primarily the changes to IPRs and post-grant proceedings in general. And I think maybe I have a bit of recency bias in selecting this as number 2 because it's created a bit of an uproar, I would say, among the folks that I work with on a regular basis. But I think what we're seeing is that we're radically reshaping AIA trials. And that kind of began with Director Squires as opposed to the PTAB panel's deciding institution, and the new discretionary denial rules that tighten that funnel even further. And so together with the strict RPI disclosure requirements, it's now significantly harder to launch an IPR or a PGR, especially, with serial challenges. And so, this has changed the way people are thinking about, challenging a patent. And actually, I was just pulling some data the other day, and I've seen already in November a distinct increase in the number of appeals with the PTAB re-exams. So
yeah, people are moving into re-examination,
right,
because they're being prevented from going into IPR,
yep,
which is going to be at some point in time another thing that they're going to have to address, because you can't just say, oh, well, we won't initiate an IPR, but here's the re-exam, enter here, we'll take away all the claims in re-exam. That just doesn't change anything from the patent owner's perspective.
And, from my chair, I think that means a lot of, we've had a lot of changes this year that have distinctly impacted both prosecution and post-grant proceedings, in the sense that, folks are taking different paths because the paths that they were accustomed to have either become more expensive or become more difficult. And so I think that kind of pivoting can rock the industry a little bit, because, what was, last year maybe a tried and true method or something that folks leaned on now is either, more difficult for them or more expensive. If you're a firm, maybe more difficult to justify to a client. And so it forces people to be very flexible and be able to pivot on a dime. And with all the change that's occurring, I think it can just create a little fatigue. So, for example, one of the things we'll talk about today is the new examiner PAP and the, sort of, I would say, a perceived limitation of examiner interviews and how that's now changing people's focus. So I consider this something similar in the sense that, IPRs were used in sort of a distinct use case. And now, because of those limitations, people are seeking other mechanisms to get to the same result.
Yeah. And I really mean this when I say this. I don't think the PTAB 1 is going to go away, and I don't think they should go away. The engineer in me realizes that if you have a system, you need to have an error correction system, because you try and get it right 100% of the time, but perfection is the goal, but it's the goal you never achieve. It's the goal you strive to constantly achieve, so that then when you get to 96, 97, 98%, you're doing something really well, but you're never going to get perfect. I mean, it's just human nature. You're never going to get perfect. So you have to have an error correction system. The one thing that is encouraging, and at this time of year, you go around, everybody's having their holiday parties, people get together all over the place. And the same is maybe even more true in the DC area, where you have all the think tanks and you have all the companies and law firms and everybody. So you get a lot of opportunity, and the awards shows and stuff, IPO, which is at IPO recently. So you get to talk to a lot of people this time of year, all in one place. And the one thing I am hearing more than I had ever heard, and it's probably not shocking, everybody seems to believe that what we really need is to rethink IPR, rethink PTAB. And the reason is, I think the patent owners have wanted to do that for the last 15 years.
That's right. Right? That's right.
And now all of a sudden the shoe feels like it's on the other foot for really the first time. And I know Andre, when he was there, did a lot, and he did do things and move in a pro-patent direction, but there were limits to what he was able to accomplish in his time there. And now we're moving, as I've said, foot on the accelerator. And so the alleged infringing community, the defendant community, I think for the first time sees a runway where they are going to have real difficulty. So they want, oh, hey, we need to reconsider these things. And yes, that's what we've been saying all along. Because I don't want the extortion artists out there using patents. And I know they're out there. And everybody knows that. It costs, what is it now, like $350 or whatever it is. I don't even know what it is to file a federal complaint. A few $100s. So if they get like $351, they made $1. So that's why they're willing to settle these cases, some of them for 10 grand, 20 grand. They're flipping. It's extortion. But the fact of the matter is those patents never wind up getting challenged because it costs too much. So I think we need to think the whole system through and say, well, where are the bad actors? Why haven't we been able to use this in order to stop those bad actors? What could we do to stop those bad actors? Oh, and by the way, maybe we should stop harassing those people who have multi-million-dollar, maybe even billion-dollar inventions that you just don't want to pay for.
Yeah, I definitely think that this change is something where, the patent owners may certainly benefit. I talk to a lot of practitioners who are thinking through, okay, how am I going to challenge moving forward, as opposed to, the patent owners who might benefit because fewer challenges may be instituted.
Yeah, not shocking. I'm hearing a lot of folks that have done IPR think that maybe what they should be doing is moving into litigation. And that would make a lot of sense to me because it's complementary, right? When IPRs are easy, then there's not as much litigation. When IPRs are tougher, there will be more litigation.
Yeah,
And
absolutely. And as we move into our next topic, I think this is sort of tied for two, but I put it as three. And I think that's because really I've heard so much talk of 101. And I remember when we were at IP Watchdog Live. When was that? It was in March earlier this year. And we were talking a lot about legislation and 101 in general. And the general consensus I get is that a lot of folks are feeling really positive about I don't know if I want to say changes, if that's the right word yet, around 101, but definitely there's a pro-eligibility tilt here in this administration. And a few really important things have happened. I actually tried to kind of pull a timeline because there's been such a series of events. First in July, we had the AI-focused eligibility guidance was published. And then in August, there was the reminder memo to examiners, which basically stated, the USPTO is reminding patent examiners how to apply 101 rules correctly. I think obviously that's one of the real challenges is sort of the disparity in interpretation of the law. And that was especially geared towards software and AI related claims. And so while it didn't change the law, it sort of emphasized consistency in how 101 is applied. And then in September, the USPTO designated a PTAB appeals review panel decision, the Desjardins decision, as precedential. And that was a big move because it serves as a model for future decisions. And then in December, just recently, new guidance on eligibility declarations was issued, encouraging applicants to submit subject matter eligibility declarations, and which is really a way for applicants to provide evidence supporting why their invention should be eligible under 101. So we've had just this sort of massive cascade of events, and I know you and I chatted before this. Should we get into some of the legislation around this here or not? But it does seem like this administration is really committed to creating what I would consider positive change around 101 and just eligibility in general.
that's what it certainly seems like. And in December, they also just updated the MPEP. So this is not window dressing. And for those people who are patent practitioners, the MPEP, that's the Bible for examiners. You're never going to convince an examiner that a case means something different than the MPEP says, even if the MPEP is wrong. So the examiners apply the MPEP. Now, we can argue about, not all examiners do that the right way. Yeah, of course, there's 8,500 plus or minus examiners. There's always going to be some who don't follow the rules, or that, don't follow what you think is right or whatever. But the rule is they're supposed to follow the MPEP. So getting a change like this into the MPEP and putting the Desjardins ruling into the MPEP, I think is a big step.
Right.
And will have trickle down effect. The and maybe this is not surprising going back to number one with Secretary Lutnick. If you look at his patents, they're software. You know, a lot of them are gaming related. You know, think of Las Vegas kind of casino games, that sort of thing. But those are all software, and it's not shocking that he would want to also do something with 101 and not just look at the P tab. And this is also fits. And I haven't heard President Trump talk about it like this. And maybe he does. Maybe it's just that people wouldn't resonate with the population. But they're all in about AI. He wants to not just do well in AI. He wants to dominate AI, and I get that, and that makes all the sense in the world to me. But we're not going to do that if we don't have changes to patent eligibility in the U.S. AI, I'm not saying that you should be giving these patents out like candy, but there's a lot of ones where the AI is very valuable, very useful, and it's different, right? You know, and I used to have a patent attorney who did a lot of AI work, and she would always complain to me, you know, like a friend, you know, like when you do like bitching with your friends, right? And she was telling me about one examiner, and I told this story a few times, and the examiner is saying, well, this whole thing is abstract. You're not explaining to me how it does it and why it does it. And he goes through and explains all his objections, and he stops, and she says, okay, so you understand the invention. And he said, what do you mean? He said, AI by its nature is abstract. I can't tell you what it does. That's why it's valuable. I can tell you how it's set up. I can tell you how we program it. We can tell you how we train it. We can tell you, but the thing that makes it unique is it takes all of this disparate information and stuff and does things that look like it's black magic. And then it iterates and it learns. And it's, so the fact that that you think it's abstract is precisely where the value is.
Right. We have to evolve with the times. I think that's, everybody's sort of why there are, folks who really support this, because things are changing so quickly on that front. I think the critics or some of the skepticism I've heard around this is more that, this guidance doesn't change the law itself, and that, federal courts may not follow the USPTO guidance. And so, there's certainly still work to be done here. But at the same time, I think everyone would, for the most part, agree that we're making steps in the right direction to sort of catch up with the changing landscape.
I agree. And I do think that it makes a lot of sense, particularly when you're looking at AI-related invention, to be focusing on the utility, the application, the result. And then, of course, you have to explain it enough so that somebody of skill in the art could get there. But this is not a mechanical invention where there's going to be gears and levers and chains and counterweights, and where you can look at all this stuff and say, okay, well, this is what's going on here, and force this way, force that way, results in this push or pull over there. It's not how AI works. It's not how the computers work, and we have to become comfortable with understanding that. And I think I think the Desjardins case goes a long way. I think the updates to the MPEP go a long way, the guidance from this summer. And it's not like a tsunami, but I think when we look in a year or two down the road, it will collectively feel like a tsunami, because I think they get it, and they know it needs to change, and it will change, and they're doing it incrementally, which I think is smart.
Maybe we do a mid-year check-in in 2026. We see where things have landed at that point. We should.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now,
so the next one on your list is a big one, because it's where, it's the show me the money, right? And we got a couple. I think the next couple could probably fit into that description. But the fee increases. This time last year at the beginning of 2025, about 11 months ago or so, everybody was all up in arms about this, and I guess it's died down simply because the whole world at times sometimes feels like it's on fire, so you can't be running around crazy mad about everything all the time.
Acceptance at this point, perhaps.
I think that's right. I think it is what it is, but these were not insignificant.
No. And I mean, yes, I actually was sort of surprised because when I was looking back on 2025, I realized this was 2025. It almost feels like more than a year ago. And maybe to your point, some reluctant acceptance, but also so much has happened since that has also created a lot of conversation that maybe this has sort of faded into the background a bit. But no, realistically, I think these fee increases were so important because, again, this is coming to your point about sort of conflating my next point, which is really around corporate cost cutting and how that's impacted patent filing trends in general. The fee increases combined with an economy where a lot of corporations are trying to cut costs changed the way patent filings were approached in many cases. So, because just maybe let's summarize some of the increases first, where, routine upfront fees rose, somewhere between 7.5% to 10% overall. And then continuing application fees also increased pretty significantly. RCE fees, and then sort of the cumulative effect. So the first RCE fee increased, I think, 10%, and then second and subsequent RCE fees, I think it was like a 40% increase, if I'm not remembering incorrectly. And then they implemented the new IDS size fees, which in my business, I saw quite a bit of kerfuffle around where, everybody, instead of trying to file IDSs with every single reference under the sun, instead now they're trying to limit the number of references in their IDSs so they can avoid some of those IDS size fees. And then there were PTAB and AIA trial fee increases. I think post-grant proceedings like IPRs rose about 25%. So realistically, I mean, these were really meaningful increases. And not only does that impact a assignee's decision whether to file a patent or not, it also it really changes sort of prosecution and post-grant proceedings strategy. So I've seen, for example, just sort of in the course of doing business, this real aversion now to multiple RCEs, when in the past, I saw a lot of aversion to appeals, where actually you and I just did a webinar on appeals. But we're seeing an increase in ex parte appeals, and we're also seeing a reduction in number of RCEs. Just preliminary data, right? This is still relatively new in the big scheme of things, but a lot of folks are taking a different tact when it comes to how to approach prosecution strategy because of these fees. But yeah, I would say those are some of the big trends I'm seeing associated with the fee increases. It's really not just about this is more expensive, let's hang our heads because it's going to be painful. It's also how do we avoid these and what new strategies do we take?
The increase in fees is changing behavior.
Totally.
And I think it'll change behavior in a positive way
Yeah.
because, as I shared with you when we did the webinar, I'm shocked that more people don't appeal.
Me too. And those appeals had been declining year over year.
They had been declining,
Yeah.
which was what was shocking to me when I saw that data. Because the reality is you get to a certain point and the examiner has made up their mind. Now, they could be wrong. Ultimately, the board may overturn them. But right or wrong, an examiner, after a certain number of considerations, has made up their mind. And when you look at the data, like the data that you guys have, you can see it falls off a cliff. It's for different times and with different examiners. It will, some of them, the sweet spot is you have up until the second RCE. But if you're going to file a third RCE and subsequent, your odds go to zero. It's not like low. They go to zero. And it's not just some examiners. It's every examiner's got that curve somewhere.
Exactly right.
And if you're going to continue to try and get it, then damn it, you got to file an appeal. I mean, so I do think that, and then I also think that what will wind up happening is some of these examiners, the ones that I've always referred to as recalcitrant examiners who aren't just not playing along by the rules, they can exist when people are afraid not afraid isn't maybe the right way to say it, reluctant to appeal. But I have a suspicion that now with these fee structures and people looking at appeals, and then also another initiative the Trump administration had was to really decrease the time for appeals that it took. And they're, I believe, now under a year. And I think they want to go even lower. So it's not like when I first started practicing, it could take 3, 4, 5 years to get a decision on appeal. That's not this patent office. So the fee increases may have the benefit of us getting more appeals, getting more decisions out of the board, which will inevitably, at least some of them are going to have to be pro-patent
Right.
decisions. And then it will also, I think, expose some of the examiners who are playing fast and loose with the rules, who have close to a 0% allowance rate. I mean, I don't know how an examiner could have a 0% allowance rate. And I'm not talking about the new ones. I get that. At the beginning, there's just not a density of cases, certainly not cases that they've even been allowed to sign off on. But, if you're a primary and you've been there for a minute and you're in the low single digits for allowance rate, if I was the commissioner or if I was the director, I would look at those people and want to know why. Maybe they're right. Maybe they're 100% right all the time. But in an office where about 2/3 of applications historically mature into a patent, because people don't pay for stuff they know they're not going to get. And patent attorneys are smart people. Patent agents are smart people. You would expect it to be high like that. So how is it that some people have a 3-4% allowance rate? But
I will say this didn't make the list, but I was just reading about the USPTO's data quality initiative, and they are going through a real sort of investigation and audit, I would say, of disparities in certain data points for examiner sort of variability, I would say. And I think that's going to be a really important initiative. Obviously, in my world, I see a lot of say complaining about how, one examiner may, approach something very differently from another examiner, even inside the same art unit, for example. And so I think it's really great that the USPTO is taking the opportunity to look at that data and, roll out initiatives around maybe it's more comprehensive training, et cetera. But I do know that that's underway. So I think that that's great. And maybe when we meet this time in 6 months, we will be talking about the outcome of what some of those changes have created for the space.
And I think the answer is closer to having, 60 to 70% of these applications ultimately wind up in a patent. I think that historically has been the case. I think that's where we probably should be. But whatever the case is, if that's not where we should be, based on whoever makes that decision, it's got to be uniform. It's always felt to me like patent applicants should be making equal protection clause arguments, because you get a good examiner, I get it. Not good is not, because I don't know that it's good versus bad. I think it's philosophical. You get an examiner who likes patents or isn't afraid to issue patents versus one who doesn't like patents and doesn't want to issue patents. And you can philosophically make the case for both, but there is disparate treatment.
There is certainly disparate output, that we can confirm. And so digging into why that is and creating initiatives around solving for that, I think is a really important, thing for the office to take a look at this year. Maybe as we move into our next point, this is an interesting area as far as sort of both examiner behavior and then corporate approaches to cost cutting. They do have some parallels, and I'll kind of explain what I mean here, which is I have seen in the course of the last year in-house teams really struggling with the idea of cutting costs, and that's persisting into 2026. And a lot of that is the result of things like inflation and interest rates that are simply macroeconomic, to policy changes like tariffs, changing where R&D is done, and the expense for corporations that, now has to be cut from other areas. And so, the business at large is looking to all of its divisions to cut costs, and IP is included in that. And so these IP teams are saying, hey, I either have to do more with the exact same budget I had last year, which is sort of cost cutting in its own right, or I literally have to pull 10 to 20% of my spend out. Where am I going to go find that? And so as a result, the big trend I've seen is primary initiatives around cost cutting that include much more aggressive maintenance fee pruning is one. The second is filing fewer patents, but filing more sort of strategically, I might say, being a lot more judicious with where and what is being filed. And finally, trying to cut costs in prosecution, which includes in large part the fees that are being spent on outside counsel firms. So I see a lot of corporations consolidating the number of firms that they're working with, and then really trying to negotiate that best bang for your buck, so to speak.
Right.
And that often is in the form of flat fees. And I see a lot of corporations saying, hey, outside counsel firm, I need you to either keep those fees flat, even though your costs are increasing, or I need you to decrease these fees. Go try AI, get more efficient, right? Be more creative, but you've got to cut costs. And the firms who are doing that are kind of winning the day in many cases. And so, to kind of tie this back to the examiner point is I've actually worked a lot with corporations who are taking a much more proactive approach to reviewing what's in prosecution. Often in-house teams have sort of farmed out patent prosecution to outside counsel firms and said sort of that's not my monkey. And the firm, I trust the firm to go do what they need to do. And now I'm seeing a lot of corporations try to identify things like, hey, are we spending too long on these applications? Should we abandon? Should we appeal? They're taking a much more active role in prosecution and collaborating more with their outside counsel firms in order to get to allowance faster, make sure that prosecution is more compact, cut hundreds of thousands of dollars out of the pending application portfolio. And that's been generally effective, but it's really changed the relationship between the corporation and the firm doing the prosecution work. In fact, I have a couple of customers who have created what they call IP policies, where they set rules for their outside counsel firms about when to abandon, when to interview, when to appeal, right? It's very prescriptive in order to cut costs and ensure that they're kind of looking at the data. And that includes looking at examiner data to say, okay, this examiner has a really low allowance rate. We are not going to go 6 office actions with this examiner. We are going to, they have a high interview win rate, so we're going to first interview, and then we're going to appeal if we get to say, a fourth non-final, et cetera. Just much more sort of focused, deliberate approach there with all of these sort of changes in mind, right? Success rates in front of a 101 rejection or, the examiner's historical behavior, things of that nature. So it all kind of ties back to this extreme need to cut costs.
We're going to have to do more on this moving forward. I don't know whether we do a podcast or a webinar on just this topic, because my mind is racing with so many thoughts and so many questions. And, I know that there are some very large patenting companies out there that have sophisticated in-house teams that operate like law firms. And I think that's starting to become a little bit more popular than it ever was. And they still hire outside law firms for some things, but a lot of the stuff that they might be considered more routine, they prepare, file, prosecute in-house.
Absolutely right. Or they're hiring patent agents, or maybe they're doing the provisionals, and then so they're starting to kind of take some of it in-house just to cut costs, and they usually pick sort of a track of things that they'll focus on versus what they're gonna send to the outside counsel firm.
Right, exactly. And then the other thing that I always think, well, what would I do if I was a general counsel or chief IP counsel and I had work to give and work to do that needed to be done and this sort of thing. And not to try and offend my friends at big firms in big cities, but if I were in that position, I would not be looking at DC, New York, San Francisco, probably not Chicago. I mean, I would be looking at, maybe St. Louis. I'd be looking at, and then not even St. Louis because it's a city, because now there are great patent attorneys and great patent firms all over the place. Yeah. But, these so-called second-tier cities, the cost is just different, right?
I've seen this firsthand where people look for IP, boutique IP firms that are in, say, Minnesota, et cetera. It's happening.
And I think it's happening more, and I'm shocked it hasn't happened more sooner. But I think, and maybe for a minute there, people convinced themselves that it was not necessary, because when COVID happened, we're all going to work from home forever. Isn't this wonderful? I can work on my boat with my laptop, or I can work at the beach or whatever, and that lasted for a few minutes. And now I think certainly by the time we have this conversation 5 years from now, I think that's good. Oh, wow, we were crazy when anybody thought they were going to work from home. And I always tell people, like the younger people want to work from home. And I'm like, you want to work from home right up until you have children. And then you are going to beg whoever you're working for at the time to give you an office somewhere that's not in your house. But I also think people are starting to get more comfortable. More companies are having at least a few days a week. And I think the happy medium, and this is a longer conversation probably for a different day, but I do think the happy medium is going to wind up being somewhere where you come in probably more often than you're at home, but there's flexibility, so if you're, and I know we do that here at IP Watchdog, like, so if your kid is sick, stay home, and you can work from home. Do most things from home anymore, truthfully, like we all know. But I would rather you not have to take a full day of PTO off because your child isn't feeling well. There's stuff you can do. So I think that flexibility, that human element to managing employees is going to go a long way. But I do think that will mean that people are going to need to have a footprint. It'll probably be a smaller office footprint than it was pre-COVID. But why are you paying for New York City real estate? Why are you paying for San Francisco? Those are two of probably the 5 most expensive markets on the planet.
And I think, I probably should have put a bullet for this. Now we're going to get into, we're getting on 15 bullets at this point, but, we're seeing a lot of cost compression to the firms on their flat fees, what people are willing to pay to actually just get and acquire a patent. And we're also seeing a lot of technologies emerge to help make that process more efficient, which I do have a bulleted thing for. But in the bigger scheme of things, one of the sort of points of advice and counseling we've been giving to our firm customers, and what I'm seeing a lot of firms do, is they need to be able to enable their clients to do these things. If their number one goal is cost cutting, and inherently the firm is charging them fees, right? They have to find strategic ways to help them cut those costs. So can you help your client identify the patents they should prune? Can you help your client, be more efficient in prosecution? Can you save them money in these other areas so that, your fees are not just simply there to go and acquire their patents, they're to lend a strategic hand and help them, realize some of these goals. And I think if they can all get on the sort of the same page toward what those key initiatives are, then they'll be a lot more symbiotic.
Absolutely. And I think you did a webinar with Dean Giebel, didn't you?
That's right. That's right.
So Dean, and I bring him up, and he's become a good friend over the last few years. He's a frequent speaker at our programs. I just always feel smarter when I hear him talk. And one of the things he says all the time, and I don't think law firm attorneys really have internalized what he says, is as an in-house person, he's chief patent counsel at Samtech. He has business. He needs law firms. He needs lawyers. What he wants are people who come to him with ideas and say, okay, this is what you should be doing, or this is what you could be doing, or this is what we could do for you that would be different, that would be higher quality, save you money. Here's markets that, maybe you hadn't considered that you should consider. You're in markets that you shouldn't be in. And he's looking for value add.
That is spot on. Firms can either take direction from the client, or they can come in as the expert and teach the client something they don't already know. And I think those tides are shifting. Those are the relationships that these corporations are finding most valuable. So absolutely.
And I think maybe it's just that patent attorneys aren't, we're engineers and scientists. So there are not a lot of people that are engineers and scientists. And maybe that's part of it. But I do think you need to be able to take orders and directions and do what the client tells you to do ultimately and follow their lead. But I think you also need to have ideas yourself and try and lead the client to do the things that would be potentially in their best interest, and maybe it wouldn't be, and they can inform you of that. No, that's not what we want to do because of this. Well, now you've got some knowledge and information, and you if you really want to help a client, be a part of their team, help them succeed, come up with ideas. And then if they say, no, we don't want to do that, okay, don't be upset or anything that they didn't take your idea. Just go and do what they want. But for God's sake, come up with some ideas. That's what people want, because I don't think most law firm attorneys realize just how undermanned, understaffed, underfunded the internal legal departments are. They're starved for resources. I mean, you got a whole firm of people. Sometimes these people have one or two people, or they have a small team of attorneys and maybe a paralegal and a secretary, and they've got a portfolio that is way larger than that internal team should really be managing. That's why they need you. Is they're leveraging you because they don't have enough in-house resources to do it.
Yeah, the bandwidth constraints are extraordinary, and
it is. And those bandwidth constraints apply to strategy as well. So,
exactly, to strategy as well, and to even some of these, the maintenance fee pruning I keep bringing up because it seems to be sort of the theme of the moment. But it's really difficult for these teams to get together. I mean, some of these companies have $15 million worth of maintenance fees coming up in 2026. And it's like finding the needle in the haystack to determine which ones are prunable, not to mention a pretty emotional decision for many. I think it's scary. It's scary to make the drop decision. And so if the firms can step in and help there, that's tremendous value. And the dollars we're talking about are big, right? So, I think that's a service that folks would be willing to pay for if they could cut, say, $2 million out of the 2026 budget alone just from pruning.
No kidding. And well, that's another conversation for another day as well, because, you look at these statistics and the numbers, and there's some stuff and it's like, why are you paying on that? Why are you paying on that? It's just, you're not using it. Nobody wants to use it. It's yester tech. It's not platform related. The current platforms don't build on that, and you're still paying for it, and it's like, come on now.
Yeah.
You got to try harder.
I do think, I work with a lot of great attorneys at outside counsel firms. And I think some of their differentiators are really that they come to the table with, extraordinary knowledge. They teach their clients. The clients really see them as an extension of their team. And you can feel that difference.
Well, it is different, and maybe it's that I've been doing these events now for so long, putting these events on, and I see what happens, and I see a lot of good networking, and I see a lot of bad networking. Now, in our events, I think I tend to see a lot more of the good stuff, and because we draw, I think, a different crowd to our events. But there are some that are things that are just awkward, and it feels like we're back in junior high school dating, and we're playing that game of, well, shotgun. If I ask 30 girls to the dance, one of them has got to say yes, right?
Right. Well, and
it's like that's
for firms who are doing what is virtually business development and sales, right? A lot of these attorneys, that's not their area of background. Like you just mentioned, you got a lot of STEM degrees in the room, and
right.
They were never trained on how to necessarily network like this or grow their books of business. And a lot of the firm practitioners that I work with have been tasked with growing their books of business by X%. They don't necessarily have business development teams to help them, and so I really do sympathize to some degree with that.
So we need to have that conversation, because I've done some writing on good rainmaking, and I think it's all about relationships.
Yeah.
And but we should have that conversation, because I think a lot of people might be interested in that conversation. In the nutshell, and then we got to move on here. But the nutshell for me is, you as a geeky, nerdy STEM person, what you just need to be, embrace the nerd, right? Nerds rule the world. And when you get your nerd on and you're talking to somebody else who has the same nerd complex and interest that you have, in our space, that's a marriage made in heaven.
Yeah.
Because you talk in the same language, and stuff that they need specialized work being done in. So I don't think it's as hard as a lot of patent attorneys think it is, but you got to try and do it.
We're going to put a pin in that one. That's a great movie podcast, et cetera, for a later date. I like that one.
But we need to move on. And the next two are sort of related. They're the same, two sides of the same coin, I think. You have the AI modernization push for the PTO, and then you have AI being used for practitioners. And this is really not caught steam in 2025, but I think it's been ratcheted up a level. I suspect it'll be ratcheted up a level or two going into 2026 and throughout the year. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, sort of AI on multiple fronts, right? These two bullets, not to be confused with the definitions around AI inventorship, but this is more, how is the USPTO using AI? And also, just doing things to expedite examination and reduce the backlog, which I think, Going into 2025, we all knew the backlog was becoming this increasingly painful problem. And I think the USPTO has done a really nice job in trying to roll things out that are going to decrease this problematic backlog. And I sympathize with the USPTO on many levels because I think every time they make a change, there's obviously critics of that change. But, a lot of what they're doing is in the spirit of, trying to confront what is really a challenging problem. And they've really made it a cornerstone of what, their focus area is. And so, while some folks are worrying maybe about quality and other things, this backlog is tremendous and it needs to be addressed. And so, one of the things that, as far as AI that's being implemented across the PTO is the new ASAP program, which is a pilot program where the USPTO uses artificial intelligence to run a prior art search before a patent application is fully examined by a human examiner. And then the other thing that's maybe less AI focused, but more backlog reduction focused is the streamlined claim set pilot program, which, that actually started, I think, in October. And is intended to speed up patent examination by encouraging applicants to limit the number of claims they present initially. And it's funny because earlier you and I were talking about the fee increases, and some of those fee increases and new fees that were instituted were certainly put in place to impact behavior. For example, those IDS size fees, we had a lot of folks filing applications that had just enormous numbers of references in their first IDS. And so, that was an attempt to say, hey, can you get a little bit tighter on these references? And likewise, the streamlined claim set pilot program, I think, is focused on, helping move along what are more compact applications, so to speak. So I think a lot of this is in the service of moving things along more quickly, using AI to our advantage. And, my point number 7 of this list of 10, which is turning into 15 or 20 really quickly, is how AI is being used by patent practitioners to both cut cost and time out of the application drafting and OA response process, among other things. So maybe we take those in 2 chunks. I don't know. Let's see, focusing first on sort of the USPTO's use of AI and some of the things they're doing to streamline examination.
Yeah, there's a lot for us to talk about here as well. It could take for a whole episode just for this, but like with the IDSs, the patent office has long wanted smaller IDSs. Tell us what you know to be the most relevant, not anything that you think somebody may egregiously misrepresent as being relevant in an inequitable conduct argument in federal court. And so they've wanted to know the best, and maybe they figured out a way to finally get people to do that. They needed some cooperation from the federal circuit. We'll see what winds up happening there. But this back up the dump truck and, dump 1 million patents and 2 million references on us, and I'm exaggerating, but only slightly.
No,
really.
I mean, it does. It happens. There's no doubt about it.
It does happen. And it can't happen. I mean, that's just ridiculous. I mean, that goes to the other extreme of, well, if you're dumping that much on people, you're hiding the relevant stuff.
Yes.
That you know about. And so we'll see what winds up happening there. I think that would be a positive benefit if we got a more realistic view of what it means to be honest with the patent office.
Right.
And it not have negative consequences with you. But my thought about the patent office using AI, I'm all in favor of it. A lot of the tools I've seen, the searches are already, I think, better than human searches. And examiners will take issue with that probably. But the one thing examiners they like going back to the references they know and building from there. And it might take them 2, 3, 4, 5 additional references to say no to you, when in fact, if they did a full searching and had instant memory and recall like an AI can, they would find a reference that's much closer than their starting reference.
Yes, AI is built for this, right? And I think
that's what it is. Yeah, this is the use case.
And prior art search is hard. hard, right? And it's if
It
that's
is.
something we can crack with AI, like by all means. I think the challenge is that AI is going through, its development period. And so,
Mhm.
the first results might not be ideal, and then 6 months from now they get better and better and better. And I think we
Yep.
just have to continue to experiment with it, continue to optimize and train it. In a couple of years, we're going to have some really great, not that we don't have great technology now, but even better
It's just going to,
technology. Yeah.
right, even better. It's definitely very good right now, but it's going to get even better. And I think, though, as the patent office does use this more and more and it continues to get better, you're going to get, if you identify better prior art at the beginning, then the claims are going to be better examined and tighter and are going to be far more likely to be valid than they are now. And then I also think that then that is going to pay dividends for trying to get, if those people who want to get rid of the PTAB, which I don't think you're ever going to get rid of, as I said before, but I think you can minimize it dramatically. And the higher quality of the patents, and we did this AI search and we couldn't find anything. And then I think we can shift the burden onto the challenger in a much more aggressive way and say, hey, why should we hear this challenge when we've done all of this, the AI search, the quality is better. So I think it's like, pushing down on different pressures. And what you'll find is that there won't be something bulge in the middle. I think it's just going to be pushing down, pushing down, pushing down, pushing down with, better searching, better quality, better. And what you're going to see is then the number of cases that should be and will be addressed by the PTAB is going to shrink with these pressures down to force higher quality.
Right. And I think to your point, a lot of the post-grant proceedings, it all starts from the beginning, patent quality, examination quality, et cetera. And so if we can get a lot of these front-end challenges addressed and use AI to do it, then, we can have a much more positive outcome on the back end. And
then when you're talking about practitioners using it, as the office uses it more, practitioners are going to have to use it.
They have to.
Because they're going to be at a disadvantage if they're not.
I just I was in New York and speaking on a panel about AI and its use in patent prosecution. And in the last year, we have seen such a tremendous change here. So, I can even think back to when I was at IP Watchdog Live in March, and I was at lunch and I was chatting with a group of practitioners about, are you using Gen AI to draft patent applications? And everyone said, I've tried it. It's not very good. It doesn't work. That was the general consensus. And in the last 6 months, I have seen almost every firm I work with, et cetera, adopting some kind of Gen AI somewhere in the prosecution journey. And, I think the patent drafting and office action response argument automation, I would say that's still in, not to say people aren't doing it, but it's more, especially the firms who are doing a lot of the prep and process, there's typically pockets of folks who are using it a little bit more actively, or groups that are really testing it heavily now, really trying to get it into the motion. It might not be firm wide, and I think there are still a lot of practitioners who are resistant to adopting Gen AI. But in the big scheme of things, it's sort of like, if you're not thinking about using Gen AI for drafting in some way, shape, or form, it might not be your be all end all, but if you're not thinking about it, if you're not trying it, you're already behind. I'm going to say it.
Yes.
You're already behind. And I'm also seeing a lot of variety in the types of tooling folks are using. So, everything from sort of frontier models to more off the shelf solutions. But it's been really interesting to see that evolve, even since March. Some other areas where Gen AI is being deployed a lot more widely is already, we talked about prior art search. I'm seeing a lot of it being used by corporations and firms as well, but for automating inventor disclosures. That's a really popular arena. I'm also starting to see tools emerge for things like identifying litigation opportunities, which is really interesting.
Yep.
So, infringement that has occurred. So there's so much what I consider really awesome technology. And again, I sort of just encourage folks, stick with it. It's changing rapidly. If you tried it in March and you didn't like it, try it again. It's like this landscape is just so ever-changing.
It's dynamic. And I do think one of the other great use cases for AI right now is if you write something and put it into AI, it can make it better.
Yeah.
it does enhance it. And I think if you're doing that with invention disclosures with a bunch of engineers and scientists who are not particularly good writers, but they're highly educated, and they certainly know what they've invented. If they have a tool that they can safely use, and I mean safely in terms of the confidentiality aspect of it, not going out on the web and doing it that way, but a safe internal tool could really help them make much better disclosures.
Yes, and, you can train these things, right? They get smarter, and it's really fascinating, I think, folks who are kind of building their own internal tool sets are starting to build something that's really sort of proprietary in nature, which is nice, and that they can kind of teach it from, their own sort of set of experiences. So, I'm all for it. I think it's fascinating. I just think people have to remain open-minded, keep trying,
Yep.
don't close the door on it just because you had one bad experience.
I agree. And I always tell people, they're like, oh, it's not very good or whatever. And you are hearing that less and less. But
Yeah.
there's a different level of energy and effort and time to create something than to edit something.
Yes.
So if I can write what I have in my mind and not have to worry about, oh, that's a run-on sentence, it's maybe not as clear as it could be, and you get it on paper, however you take, or talk into a microphone and have it transcribed for you, run it through ChatGPT, or not I shouldn't say that. I do that for stuff when I'm writing articles because it's not confidential or proprietary. I want to get some ideas and stuff like that. Or I use it all the time for panel descriptions and for title descriptions.
Yes.
But so I know it's good at this. I know it's very good at this. So use a safe system that doesn't have the confidentiality issues and have it rewrite it. And then when you look at it, you're like, wow, that's pretty good, but it needs more here, needs more here, needs more there. That's wrong. I'll take that out. And then tighten it up. And it's like, wow, that compared to what you fed it, it's like, that's really didn't take me all that long to get there. So this is a perfect use case. Don't be afraid of the use cases that work. Searching works, rewriting, editing works very well. And all the other stuff is getting better and better and better almost week to week.
And a lot of it, to your point, is how you prompt it, right? So that the sort of
Yes.
somebody once referred to it as sort of the vibe coding of, you don't have to necessarily have it generate something from scratch, although you certainly can, but more you can prompt it and converse with it, so to speak. And it's really interesting what it comes away with, and it can also really help reduce I think what you're describing is a lot of the manual work. Like, use your brain on a lot of the strategic stuff, and then allow it to sort of take care of a lot of the other minutia that is painful and time-consuming, expensive.
And just before we move on from this one, to tie it back to something we already talked about with the money and the costs and the fees, if your clients haven't already started asking about lower fees because you're using AI, or you could be using AI, that's going to come. And so if you're not using these tools now and getting good with them, when the clients start wanting to pay even less because it should take you less time to draft that office action response, or it should take you less time to get to an application or set of claims or whatever, you're going to be in a world of hurt if you don't know how to use these tools. Now, I do think if I were general counsel or chief IP counsel, I would not want my attorneys to charge me less. What I want them to do is use these tools to get me better patents and better rights and more enforceable, less challengeable kind of rights. But not every client thinks that way. So these tools are going to become a necessity.
The in-house teams often want to, what I would call, share in the savings, right? So I think there's a delicate balance there between, forcing your outside counsel firm to do something unnatural, and, between assuming as a firm that you will be the only one to reap the benefits of the savings from some of those AI tools, right? Goes both ways.
Maybe for the minute, but that's not going to be a long minute.
No,
You're gonna,
it is not.
It's coming. It's coming. It's coming.
Is.
All right. So then number 8 here on the list, and then I think we got a couple honorable mentions here, is workforce and examiner union culture. There's a lot that's happened in this year about that.
And of course, a lot of it comes back to the attention toward the backlog and reducing that backlog. And so, we saw the examiner performance appraisal plan change in October, and there were a couple of key components of that, but one of them was that interview incentives changed. So examiners now get credit and are thus incentivized for only one interview per application, or RCE, that occurs during prosecution. And if they want to do more interviews, they have to get supervisor approval and then justify it by showing that it's going to actually advance prosecution. And because these extra interviews require approval and they don't automatically generate credit, examiners have less maybe perceived motivation to conduct them. I've heard a lot of sort of conflicting feelings on this. I think the practitioners, the patent agents and attorneys out there saw this as, oh my gosh, interviews are one of the best means I have to get to resolution quickly and inexpensively with this examiner, and now I can only do one. My perspective is a little bit that a lot of applications go without examiner interviews to begin with. Maybe the focus is a little more on one really impactful interview. And I was at IP Council Cafe in New York, and Coke Morgan Stewart was there, and she said, the real goal of this is not to limit interviews. We at the PTO agree that this is, these are really important mechanisms for advancing prosecution. We just want to make sure that these subsequent interviews are really worthwhile. And so if it's going to advance prosecution, a second, third, et cetera, interview is worth doing. And so I think there's just sort of two sides of the coin here, but those changes to examiner sort of incentives, again, impact the way people perceive prosecution strategy and the paths they take. The other area I've heard here is sort of a concern about quality, because in the new PAP, they've shifted the weight of performance metrics. So production and quality now count for more, about 40%. And examiners have to meet higher production goals to be rated sort of fully successful. And again, those have changed sort of what maybe they prioritize. And so I think there's concern to some degree that will impact quality of examination. But on the flip side, this is all sort of in the spirit of getting through the backlog, being more efficient, not spending time on, activities that drag things on. So I don't know, Gene, what's your perspective?
No, I agree with you. And I think that I know Juristat has looked at this, and less than a third of cases are interviewed.
I know.
I was just reading, and I have heard at times, and this obviously changes over time and depending upon what you're looking at and what time frame and the area, but sometimes it's closer to 20%.
Yeah.
1 in 5. So this, I know a lot of people have gotten very upset about the perceived pulling back of interviews, but the reality is the overwhelming majority of cases are not interviewed, and so they will not be affected.
And really, we should just attempt to interview more often in general, although
Right.
not all examiners are hyper receptive to interviews. I think, again, kind of looking at the data and determining what does this examiner's sort of track record show me. So it's not a one size fits all approach, I don't think. And at the same time, overwhelmingly, when you interview, you increase your likelihood of allowance by 10 percentage points.
Yeah, absolutely. So I do think that the big story here is that 60 to 80%, depending upon the area, the art unit, the time frame in which you're looking at this data, of cases that don't get interviewed should be interviewed. As a general default reason, you should go into this and say, I should be doing an interview. Now, as you say, if you look at the examiner information and that doesn't play out, then you could always violate that default position and say, and not this time.
Right.
But there's a whole lot of opportunity for people who aren't doing interviews to do interviews that you're not doing. And then I think also what the office has seen is that there's some examiners that just do interview after interview all the time, do a lot of interviews, and there's not a lot of evidence that, once you get past this, like a second interview or something, that there's any real benefit.
Yeah, that it's
there.
advancing prosecution, right? So these are
Right.
the hard sweeping changes that the office has to make, I think, to, get more efficient. Now, all of that being said, I understand the concern, right? I understand the concern there. And if a second interview is really meaningful and you can't get one, right, that could be frustrating. So, it's a double-edged sword, certainly. The other component I was thinking of when we were talking about just sort of examiner shifts and workforce shifts is that in August, I believe it was, an executive order labeled the USPTO's patents unit as a national security entity. And that resulted in the decertification of the union that had been representing the examiners. And I know that created a bit of I think this is the second time I'm using this word, but kerfuffle, because it removed collective bargaining protections, and it sort of raised concern about examiner morale. So that's something that the USPTO has to contend with, which is, there's been that change in union representation. There's also been these modernization mandates. There's been a bit of cultural pivot as examiners are refocused more on core examining tasks. And anytime there's sweeping change like that, it creates cultural movement. And so I think, if you read in the Reddit threads and things of that nature, you see there are some challenges culturally speaking there.
So at the risk of upsetting examiners, which I just probably can't help but not do, I guess there's some examiners that just get upset with whatever I say, but I want to say that I'm probably the only patent attorney in the world that has ever represented a union. I did so at the very beginning of my career when I was working at a firm, and we did all kinds of general stuff, and we were literally right across the street from the Manchester Police Department. So one of the partners had been representing the Manchester Police Supervisors Union. I think his billing rate was higher than what they wanted to pay, so it wound up being my client. I took over the client, so I have I understand the union issues probably a little bit more than your average patent attorney. Having said that, I'm conflicted here because this particular union has historically, not always, but over long stretches of time, more often than not, I think, has gotten in the way of sensible reforms to the patent system, to improving quality. And so I think the union has not been the partner that it could have been if it wanted to get some of the benefits that they said that they wanted to get. And then the one thing that happened lately, and I don't know how widely known this is, but in order to push down the backlog at the beginning of the Trump administration, they wanted to pay the examiners more money. They wanted them, if you're willing to pick up extra cases over than what you're already required to do your job, we'll pay you extra money. This is new money. This was not bonuses. I know examiner performance and their workload is tied to their bonus. This was not this was new additional money.
Right.
For picking up, and not an outrageous number of cases. It was like a couple extra cases a quarter. And the union said no. The union said no. It's like, well, we won't agree to that unless you reopen collective bargaining because there's some other stuff we want over here. And to me, that is like, are you kidding me? The thing that I spent time working with when I represented the union was always more money. It's better working conditions, better benefits. And so you're telling me you're offering my members more money and I'm going to say no. And so when I heard that, I'm like, okay, this particular union at this moment has jumped the shark. They don't get what they're doing. And you say, yes, thank you, we'll take more money. and you chalk up the win. And it wasn't even mandatory. If you didn't want to do it, you didn't have to do it.
Yeah. No matter what, the examiners, it's certain they've gone through quite a bit of change. Change creates fear and uncertainty sometimes, no matter how well you manage it, it's just sort of human nature. And so I think, we in 2025 and subsequently in 2026 are sort of watching how examiner behavior changes with some of these new policies. And maybe we progress into number 9 just because I know you and I committed 1 hour. We committed 1 hour. Here we are,
So this is going long, but it's all good. It's all good stuff. One thing to put just before we go past the examiner issues, I think hopefully all of those issues have worked their way out.
Yep. I'm hopeful. I think there's a lot of also positive change going on. And again, we've got a few years to see how this plays out. Speaking of a few years and how this plays out, we put at number 9 legislation. And I know because you're in DC, you're so plugged into policy. And that's one of the things I really enjoy about going to IP Watchdog Live is, getting sort of the policy angle on a lot of this. We've got some important legislation out there. To your point earlier, maybe nothing has quote unquote happened yet, but tell us a little bit about the policy landscape and why you think that was an important ad for the top 10.
The reason that I wanted to bring this up at this point as part of our top 10 was because at the end of last year, there was a lot of momentum. There was a lot of people who were very excited, who thought that maybe this year would be the year that we could get some of these bills through, whether it be PARA or Prevail are probably the most ripe, the most discussed, but there's also the Restore bill regarding injunctions. And I think people inside the Beltway who follow this didn't necessarily think that there was going to be a large opportunity to get these bills passed in 2025. But the hope is that we would at least get closer. And we just haven't gotten closer, and we maybe have potentially gotten further away because Senator Tillis has decided that he's not going to run for re-election. And that means that the leadership in the Senate IP committee is up for grabs, and we really don't know who's going to take the reins, and we don't know what their priorities are going to be. The reason that that's important is because this subcommittee, this IP subcommittee, really had life interjected back in it once Senator Tillis got elected and went to Congress. So without him, what's going to happen? Yes, we still have Senator Coons. Senator Coons is still very pro-patent. He really understands the issues. He is a real leader on these issues. But the problem that maybe it's not even a problem really, but Senator Coons is in a very safe state. It's a blue state. He probably has far more to worry about from a primary challenge than he does a general election challenge. And normally when you see somebody who has his level of seniority, because he's been in the Senate for quite a while now, and they're in a safe state, same thing in the House when you're in a safe district, you tend to start to get a different portfolio of issues that maybe are a little bit more controversial. And just being in the Senate as long as he's been, Senator Coons is going to be starting to get a portfolio of more influential issues with real gravitas. Not that IP doesn't have real gravitas, at least to us, but for the general public, this is not really an issue that you see people vote on and make decisions on. So I don't know what the future of these bills are if they don't happen in 2026. I think we're going to be maybe out in the wilderness for a while, and that's going to be very unfortunate and not what a lot of people had hoped. Again, not that we thought that we would get them this year, but that we would at least get closer, and we're no closer at all as far as I can tell, and that's very disappointing.
Yep, I think that's sort of what I'm hearing as well. And I think there was a lot of hope around PARA in particular, obviously kind of coming full circle to the 101 discussion. And so speaking of sort of legislation, administration, we had here on number 10, this was something you had suggested that I had actually left off my original list. And in retrospect is a really important component, which is, the Trump administration's, so to speak, attack on university patents.
Yeah, I really don't know what to make about this. And there's two separate issues that are related and very important for universities. The first is this idea that there may be a patent tax. That proposal hasn't been made public. It's been leaked. It's been widely criticized. But the idea seems to be, because Secretary Lutnick has said that he thinks that if we are giving drug companies in particular these rights on blockbuster drugs and they're making billions and billions of dollars, that they being the government, should get a piece of that money and pay it forward when they're looking for additional revenue in order to presumably pay down the debt, which I'm all in favor of paying down the debt, but I think that that's just a foolish way to go about trying to do it, because you run the risk of absolutely destroying the innovation ecosystem for really very little money, because most inventions overwhelmingly don't make money. So that's an issue for the universities, because over time, universities have become such an important part of the ecosystem for discovering new drugs. And then once they make these scientific breakthroughs, then they partner with the brand name pharmaceutical companies that everybody's familiar with that then go through the testing and the FDA processes and take these drugs to market. So if there's going to be a patent tax on these extremely valuable drugs, that's going to really trickle down and have significant negative impact for universities. The other angle here that is shocking to me, we have a pro-patent administration. Secretary Lutnick, as we have talked about here already, and as most people know, is an inventor. He's made millions of his own inventions. He's got several hundred patents himself. He is cutting back, giving marching orders to cut back on the PTAB, which will have a trickle-up effect for innovators. So there's really this belief that this administration, the second Trump administration, is very pro-patent in a large part due to Secretary Lutnick being at the Commerce Department. Now, in a pro-patent environment, why are we having the continued conversations about whether or not Bayh-Dole should be gutted, should be changed? Why is Bayh-Dole continuing to be under attack? It's under attack year after year after year, and it's starting to get very old and very frustrating, and I really don't understand why. It's been extraordinarily successful. We've had thousands of great innovations, including many that have led to significant cures and treatments. And I just don't understand what's going on here. It has spurred economies. It's created tens of thousands of new startup companies, which create jobs. It has been a absolute success, but yet year after year, we continue to fight the battle about whether or not we want to keep it or throw it away. And if we got rid of Bayh-Dole, that would just be getting rid of the baby at the bathwater. It makes no sense to me, and I don't understand. This is an existential threat for universities every time it comes up, so I don't get why it's coming up during what is otherwise appears to be a pro-patent administration. I also don't understand why a pro-patent administration would bring up the patent tax, but those are things to keep our eye on as we flip the calendar, because they're going to be extremely important, not only to universities, but particularly for universities.
Yeah, I work with a lot of tech transfer offices, and they're already under a lot of pressure because a lot of grants are being removed, right? So they're under enormous cost-cutting constraints, more so even than the in-house teams we were talking about earlier. And I think people are concerned about this primarily because, number one, it's unprecedented. I don't think there's no federal agency has ever seized or forced licensing of a university's patents under the Bayh-Dole Act before. And then, universities really depend on these patents, right? The licensing revenue helps pay for research labs and student support, new programs. And I think ultimately people are afraid that innovation could suffer and that academic freedom and autonomy is at risk. So those are all, I would say legitimate concerns. And that's definitely something we should keep an eye on as things unfold here.
I agree. It's going to be interesting to see what happens, but I have hope that things will work themselves out. There's always the possibility that the Trump administration going quote unquote after universities in the way that we've just described is really not about the universities and maybe about something else. For example, the Trump administration this past year has really tried to work with universities to cut back on some of the harassment that Jewish students have been facing. And I think that maybe there's a chance that some of what we're seeing aimed at universities may be less about intellectual property, less about innovation and patents, and more about trying to get universities to change their behavior. Time will tell if that's the case, and I hope that that is the case, because I really just think that going after universities and threatening their research money is the wrong thing to do. What we need to be doing is we need to be doubling down and giving universities more funding so that they can invest in basic science that can lead us to great new inventions and new economies. That's what we really ought to be doing, rather than questioning whether Bayh-Dole should exist or should be cut back, or we should march in and take rights, or God forbid, tax these rights when they wind up actually being valuable. It's almost as if the government forgets that when these inventions are successful, there'll be companies that are created. Those companies will pay taxes. The employees will be well paid. They will pay taxes. This is not a zero-sum game for the government. So I think we should just leave our hands off of the universities, and hopefully that's what we'll see happen in the new year. But Fran, that's probably all the time that we have for this episode. I really appreciate you being here. I think this was a fascinating conversation, and I look forward to having more conversations with you next year. I wish you a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.
Thank you for listening to IP Watchdog Unleashed. We will be back next week, and we hope you will join us again. In the meantime, please be sure to visit IPWatchdog.com to read all the latest news and information about what is happening in the intellectual property world. And also be sure to subscribe to our free daily email newsletter.